And, like a lot of people, when I thought about metabolic health, I thought about obesity and diabetes and maybe cardiovascular disease, but I did not think about cancer. And so when I started to read that cancer seemed to be a part of this cluster of diseases and that cancer was closely linked to obesity, really grabbed my attention just because I found it so unexpected. And yeah, that just sort of led me on a research path. I get excited about an idea, I start Googling and
That's great.
reading what I find. And then I, sort of quickly came across the name Otto Warburg. And, as a journalist and a writer, I look not only for good science stories, but also for good characters.
Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. Today, we're joined by a remarkable guest, Sam Adam, an acclaimed nonfiction writer and professor at Johns Hopkins University. Sam is the author of several fascinating books, including Ravenous, Otto Warburg, The Nazi, and The Search for Cancer Diet Connection, a book that delves into the profound relationship between diet and cancer. Among other books, he's also co authored the delightful children's book, Baby Dunks a Lot, with NBA superstar Jayson Tatum, a book that is full of fun, which is why I'm laughing, and is quite inspiring. Sam's sister, Jessica Apple, co founder of the Metabolic Revolution.org, and previous podcast guest, she introduced us, and I can't wait to dive into the stories and insight Sam's has to share. From his passion for writing and his thoughts on low carb diets, and even obviously his connection to basketball, we're in for a treat today. So, Sam, I really want to welcome you and thank you for taking some time to be on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Really happy to be here.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to our conversation and love your sister, Jessica. I was just, we're trying to do a petition via the Metabolic Revolution to get processed foods out of the diet. And I just got that email this morning, and I decided to. I had written a video or I'm going to release a video about the Red Dye 5, which was just banned, and it's so hopeful that. And I'm not sure if that was a nudge from the future Health Secretary RFK or not, but it's been a while since they banned things. So I'm going to actually put the petition into the video so people can kind of learn about it and participate in it. So I really like the work she's doing and getting us all involved in that mission. So I really appreciate that. So I want to start with you in terms of your journey as a writer, and what inspired you to pursue nonfiction writing.
Sure. Well, my father's a writer, so I'd always had it in my mind that it's a possible career path. And Jessica, my older sister, has done some writing, so it's kind of the family business. Um, but I got to college and found that I was better at writing papers than at doing math. So that helped as well. And yeah, I kind of fell into it. I love the career in part because I get to follow my interests as a freelance journalist. I can sort of pitch articles on whatever topics I'm most excited about, and for a long time, the nutrition stories have interested me most.
That's cool. It's funny you say that because although my podcast it leans metabolic health, obviously low carb, but my Nest and Rope acronym, nutrition, exercise, less stress, et cetera, it allows for me to kind of go in a lot of different directions. And I kind of, for the exact same reason, love to have that flexibility, that metabolic flexibility
Yeah,
to do what your heart desires. Even on YouTube, I love the fact that I can kind of hear something, think, or a patient says something or whatever, and I can say, I can talk about that. So I do like having that flexibility, and it's real nice to. I pitch to my wife. I say, "What do you think? You think people would be interested in this topic?" And then she'll, give her 2 cents. So, and speaking of family, your sister Jessica, obviously an advocate for metabolic health, but you both are well aware of the benefits of diet. So, how did you guys discover that, and who was first? Was it you or your sister?
Um, yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. I think she got there first, but what's interesting is that we really came at it from different directions. Yeah, I think she knows more about this stuff than I do. When they used to interview me about Ravenous, I would say she should really just talk to my sister. But she had diabetes in her family. I'm sure she's talked about that. Her husband had type 1, and then she was diagnosed. So that's an obvious path to sort of low carb nutrition. Whereas I came at it sort of generally interested in medicine, and I had read some Gary Taubes articles, and that was really impressed by the quality of his arguments and thinking, and just sort of grew increasingly interested. But I really like that we sort of arrived at the same point independently.
That's right. What I love about learning about your body and nutrition is who would not be interested in that? It's like literally your body and what happens to it, and ways to optimize it. So it would be easy to imagine, no matter what angle you're coming from, that it would create interest. And I really um, am always curious about learning more, getting better at it, and also just being comfortable with the experimentation that comes with it. And you just try to find what works best for you. My wife, I'm a carnivore, so I tend to try my best to stay in that space. And we messed around with Dr. Kilt's ice cream a couple of days ago, and I was nervous because my body is so sensitive, but my tolerance for heavy cream, eggs, and vanilla flavor were totally okay. I think my son probably sneaked in a little monk fruit, but it was actually okay. And it's not quite like that homemade ice cream that your aunt used to make or something, but it was pretty close. And so I just love learning, growing, seeing how my body responds, and it's been a fun journey. So, and speaking of fun, when she shared with me that you helped write a book, Baby Dunks a Lot, I got real excited. I'm a huge Chicago sports fan, led by, of course, Michael Jordan, but even Derrick Rose. And although he didn't have the career we expected because of injuries, he would have been, in my opinion, one of the top 10 guards ever because he was just so amazing.
Yeah.
So hate that that didn't happen, but I'm happy that he has found his path. So you and Jayson Tatum with the Boston Celtics collaborated on this project. Tell that story.
Sure. Well, first, I grew up in Houston, so I was a Rockets fan. So,
Okay.
yeah, maybe after the podcast, you and I can debate whether or not the Rockets would have won their championships if Jordan hadn't.
Amen.
I love debating
We
that.
may not need to debate it, but that would have been that's going to be a fun conversation.
But yeah, so I'm a huge NBA fan, and I had this idea for a basketball book about a dunking baby, and you know, I thought it was a pretty good idea, but I realized that if I wrote it, not many people would be interested. And then I thought, what if I teamed up with an NBA player? Then I reached out to Tatum's team, and he's like the perfect collaborator because he's got this son Deuce who he brings to all the game, and then you
Nice.
know Tatum and his team brought their own ideas to it. Deuce got involved picking the illustrators, and it just became this really fun collaboration. And yeah, it's been a blast. I get to work with this NBA superstar who's I love, and get to go to Celtics games, hang out with them. My kids briefly thought I was cool for doing something like this.
That's so cool. Yeah, uh he's pretty clean. He's so amazing. But he's so clean it's almost too clean. He just he does his job. Is easily one of the best players in the league, and yet it's not a lot of controversy. Family Guy, I just love that,
Yeah,
uh, and that's kind of cool. So that was a pretty safe place to land. Humor was in the book. Obviously, basketball, a lot of imagination. So, in terms of your you sounds like you're a fan. Did what really got you into this basketball world? I knew I was a tennis player growing up, so my favorite sport to observe, because I'm not a great basketball player, is, you know, basketball. But tennis is the sport I played. I played for my high school, my park district, and all of that stuff. And probably will be getting back into that. I just literally just watched something on YouTube about Joakim Noah, and he talked about his dad, who was a French, first black person to win the.
Yeah, Yannick Noah, I remember.
Yes. So, and then I didn't know that Arthur Ashe kind of, found him and said, this kid has potential. So let's bring him to France. He left his family, and obviously became the tennis star, that we now remember. But so, what anything else that kind of got you into the sport from the past?
Well, I'll just connect the two themes by saying one of the people that I loved in the basketball world growing up was John Lucas, who was also a
Mhm.
world-class tennis player. I
Mhm.
could have gone on to be a professional tennis player.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
used to go to John Lucas basketball camps as a little kid.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
but my dad watched basketball. I just always loved the game. I
Mm,
grew up during the early years when University of Houston had the Phi Slamma Jamma, Olajuwon, Clyde Drexler period, and so I just always loved basketball. Grew up watching Olajuwon go from the University of Houston to the Rockets, and then my last year of high school, they win the championship for the first time. It's just all kind of perfect.
that's
Unfortunately, it's been a long drought since then.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Uh,
Although I think they have the coach that was at Boston now, right?
oh yeah,
So
Ime Udoka.
yeah, so I mean, they look like they're starting to get it together. A
Yeah,
nice young
yeah.
team.
We're very excited about the
Yeah,
current team.
and for those who don't think coaching matters, I'm not sure I agree with that. So
Yeah,
clearly, it does
definitely
matter.
does.
The last fun question for you is, do you have game yourself? Are you a basketball player?
Well, this people find this hard to believe, but at one point I did.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Unfortunately, I peaked in sixth grade. Like in sixth grade, like I could take anybody. Uh, it's been all downhill since then. I'm not sure what happened, but I think the main thing is that I was kind of old for my grades. I had an advantage, and
That's
then
fair.
everybody else kept growing, and things
That's
just
fair.
fell apart.
Yeah, that growth thing, right? Yeah, my
Yeah.
mom. I'm gonna call her later today, and I think my dad's probably six. My biological dad's like 6.6, 2 or something. My mom is like literally 5 foot.
Uh,
So I landed at 5'10", and I was like, man, I could have been a basketball player, mom. So, but
yeah.
that's part of the deal, My kids did,
Yeah.
and my kids are taller than me. They're probably more like 6 foot, but yeah, it's just the luck of the draw. So thank you for some fun thoughts, and let's dive a little bit into the book Ravenous, which I think is really cool. So a book, thinking about Otto Warburg and the cancer diet connection. What drew you to that particular subject?
Um, yeah. Well, I mentioned before I had read Gary Taub. He got me interested in some of these themes, and I just became interested in metabolic health more generally. And like a lot of people, when I thought about metabolic health, I thought about obesity and diabetes and maybe cardiovascular disease, but I did not think about cancer. And so when I started to read that cancer seemed to be a part of this cluster of diseases and that cancer was closely linked to obesity, really grabbed my attention just because I found it so unexpected. And yeah, that just sort of led me on a research path. I get excited about an idea, I start Googling and
That's great.
reading what I find. And then I, sort of quickly came across the name Otto Warburg. And as a journalist and a writer, I look not only for good science stories, but also for good characters. So then I saw not only was there this really interesting connection between cancer and metabolism, but there's also like a really interesting character. And then like, okay, now I know how I could tell the story if I want to
That's
tell
right.
the
That's
story.
right. That's right. So if I was a 5-year old, and how old are your kids now?
My kids are 18 and I have twins who are 16.
Oh, okay, so they're still pretty young. But even if you're talking to the 16-year-olds, let's go with the twins. What's the simplest thing you would say about this concept to help them understand what a Warburg effect is? What would you say to them?
Oh, it's a good question. I'm a little out of practice. The book came out a couple years ago. But if I was talking to a really young child, I would probably say that Warburg discovered that cancer cells that cells eat just kind of like people eat, and that cancer cells eat in a different way than other cells. That's what Warburg discovered. They're really hungry for sugar, for glucose.
Yeah, that's it. And you know what's funny about the simplicity of that statement? That works for everybody. And I actually saw a patient who I'm going to feature in a YouTube video soon, who was going to be 90 in a couple of weeks from our recording. And although he was making lifestyle changes for diabetes, he and his A1C went from like 9 to 4.6, which is, you know, literally going from a 212 average blood sugar to 85 in like 4 months. And I told him about sugar and how that was the enemy and things that turn into sugar. And he just was engaged, and he just and just to see that he wasn't 9 years old, he was 90 almost. And so
Yeah.
but guess what? His risk for cancer is going to go down because most cancers love sugar. They thrive on sugar. So if we remove that from the diet, we're not feeding cancer. We're not giving it more fuel to grow. So it's good. And I think even this podcast and how I try to make videos, I try to keep it simple. You know, I could definitely do a deep journalistic dive with Gary Taubes. I could certainly talk to Robert Lustig and get a little deep. I can talk to Ben Bigman and get a little deep. But reality is most people, smart, educated, professor types, and the 5-year-old all can understand the simplicity approach, right? So everybody gets that. But when you get a little too analytical, it gets a little crazy. So I'm really happy that you were able to, you know, even with the basketball book, keep it simple. And with this book, also speak to the average person. So, um, you know, I know you're not in the oncological space in terms of cancer treatment, but since writing a book, are you hearing more people start to understand this metabolic connection to cancer? Are you starting to feel some momentum in that space just from the world you live in?
I think I am. I like to distinguish between prevention approaches and treatment approaches. So in my book, I really talk about more about prevention and why I think, a particular diet going low carb, getting, insulin levels down makes sense in terms of prevention. In terms of treatment, I didn't want to get into it too much in the book because it's still such early stages. And, I just, I'm not obviously a doctor. And so I didn't want to get too far into the weeds of treatment. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but, we just need a little more time to see what works and what doesn't work. But I am optimistic that in terms of treatment, that probably what's going to be most helpful is a combination of traditional treatments and chemotherapy together with low carb and ketogenic diets as an adjuvant therapy that makes things more effective. Um, but what I'm definitely seeing is increased interest in the field and increasing awareness of the harms of sugar in particular. And I always like to, I know we just talked about keeping things simple, and it's important to do that, but at the same time, one thing that always makes things tricky is the way we use the word sugar to mean both glucose and fructose. So
Right.
but
That's right.
I when I really try to keep things simple, I tell people just at the very least, like try to stay away from the sucrose, the sweet white stuff, that kind of sugar, because that seems, when eaten in large quantities and put into our drink seems to really drive the insulin resistance, which drives the higher insulin, which seems to drive the increased uptake of glucose and this Warburg style metabolism. So, if there's like sort of one thing I tell people to do, and I think people are more aware of, is stay away from the sweet white stuff.
That's right. It'll get you. It's hard to imagine going back to Dr. Kill's ice cream that you make ice cream without adding the abundance of sugar that's normally added to ice cream. You're just using heavy cream, which has sugar in it, uh, lactose, and you add, um, eggs, which doesn't really have sugar in it. But ultimately, this carnivore palate of mine kind of felt like there was something. I mean, obviously there may have been a little monk fruit in there, but my palate was totally okay. Like it's amazing how you just adapt and I just look at sugar um as like I look at cocaine. I mean, if I took a sugar cane, my wife's from the South, Mississippi, and she her dad used to send us sugar cane stalks and she would, like some wild animal, cut it open and she would suck on it, right? And I think that type of exposure is a little different than when you turn something into a powder. It becomes
Yeah,
literally a drug. And I think that's where we kind of fall short is that our bodies get used to that potent concentration, that potent dose. And that really throws us off. So I just think that I feel like your book it sounds like it was really about just creating awareness so that people are aware that this is a thing. This is something you need to be aware of, and hopefully it'll inspire more research and more discoveries. So
yeah. I mean, one simple way to think about it in terms of awareness is that everybody agrees that obesity is a big risk factor for many types of cancer, and if you believe that obesity is somehow involved in this, whatever is causing obesity could be said to be driving the cancer as well. And I think everybody agrees that sugar is causing obesity. So in that sense, it doesn't seem controversial at all. Like we
yeah,
should be concerned about sugar. And yet, if you Google "does sugar cause cancer," you'll get all these articles saying, "Of course not. That's crazy."
right, right,
And
right.
yet, the core logic is really pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and it's such a profound, simple solution when you reduce the things that raise your insulin. Now, of course, there's more than sugar that raises your insulin, particularly on a chronic level, right? But if we don't have chronic high insulin levels, then we are more likely to not have the many things that then harm our blood vessels and our nerves, then leading to most of the things that we worry about. So again, going to the return on investment approach, that awareness that sugar could be a problem. And let me say this out loud, and this is coming from a carnivore. I think that it's okay to indulge periodically. I don't think people should be so afraid of sugar that they never indulge. There are always folk who need to be cautious, processed
Yeah,
food addictions and things like that. But yeah, if we can indulge periodically and have discipline around that, enjoy. I mean, I think that's one of the gifts. Winnie the Pooh is a cartoon character. We shouldn't sit around and just suck on honey all day.
yeah,
The
yeah,
real bears, the real bears, they hang out by the water and get the salmon. You know what I mean? That's probably the
yeah,
best place to hang out. And if you hang out with Winnie the Pooh, you're probably going to be looking like Winnie the Pooh eventually. So
yeah.
you need to be careful.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that we need to go back about 200 years to how sugar was used, and it can be. One doctor I talked to talked about using it like a spice. Just
Mhm.
sprinkle a little bit on.
Right, that's right.
But it's just decade after decade, it's gotten out of control, and even in the last couple decades, there was some downward trending, but trended down to a level which is still astronomically high. So
Right. That's right.
it doesn't really help much. Yeah.
It's pretty high. Now, last question about your book is if you were in the elevator and someone heard about you and said, I heard you wrote this book, Ravenous. And they said, you know, who is this book for and what would they expect? So just kind of real quickly, why would somebody want to get that book? What are they going to walk away with in terms of how it's presented or, just a basic what to expect? What would you say on the elevator?
I would say that, anybody who wants to sort of do a somewhat deep dive into a very simple question on the surface is, what is the connection between the way we eat and cancer? Or is there a connection? If you're interested in that question, then I think it's, I hope a book for you, and you'll get some bonus history along the way as I talk about Warburg's life. But it's fundamentally about, trying to understand the connection between diet and cancer, because there's clearly, I mean, I think everybody agrees there's a connection, and it's been a hard thing to figure out. So I'm sort of making the case that the root of it is metabolism, as makes sense if you're talking about diet. And yeah, it's not an easy book to summarize, because I tried to weave in a lot of history
Hmm.
along the way. But it's
Nice.
fundamentally about the connection between cancer and diet, and the conclusion that I arrive at is that the key element is really insulin resistance and elevated insulin.
Absolutely. Going back to that chronically high insulin level. Totally agree. And thank you for being a storyteller. I think I would have been a much better history student if not for better professors who could maybe express it a certain way. Because I love history. I mean, I'll watch the History Channel every day if given the time.
Yeah.
So but yeah, being a storyteller is really important. Some people in the low carb space, I think Dr. Boz is a good storyteller. So we need to have people who can tell stories. And I
Yeah.
know your dad, kind of inspired you. And so when you think about your dad, Max Apple, what what types of things was he writing? Was it similar to you, or was it completely different?
Well, he is first and foremost a fiction writer. He's done both fiction and nonfiction. So different in that sense. I like to joke that my big rebellion was that I became a nonfiction writer rather than a fiction writer. Um, but one thing that really interested me, I went back and was reading some of his old short stories, like even written before Jessica, my sister, and I were born. And he had one short story about the scientist who was eating nothing but yogurt, had invented a special yogurt that he thought was super healthy. And then it occurred to me that, kind of was the type of thinking that Jessica and I eventually arrived at, like how to control your health with food. So maybe maybe there's some genetic influence there. Who knows? Um, but he's just a great writer and a great storyteller. And I've learned from reading his work and from having him as a mentor for many years.
Absolutely. You also you've written in the New Yorker, New York Times Magazine, and that sounds like a completely different world. So when you write a book versus in these great magazines, how do you approach it any differently? Is it just an abbreviated version of the book, or is it just a completely different way of telling stories?
Um, it's fundamentally similar, but obviously the book is of course much longer, so I can go into much more depth. And I have a little more freedom in the book, whereas magazine editors are often very nervous about making controversial claims, or putting forward ideas that might challenge status quo thinking. So it's not that you can't do it in a magazine, but you have to be cautious and measured and always interview somebody from the other side who, you know, says, all this stuff is garbage, it's not true. And then the reader's left to figure out which expert to believe. So, you of course want to be balanced and fair and comprehensive in anything you write. But I just like the freedom to be able to really make the argument that I want to make without having to say, this person says this and this person says this. It's really freeing in a sense. And also just to, sort of follow my intellectual interests. If I come across an interesting scientist that I might want to add a few pages around that scientist's background, I can't do that in an article. There's not the space for it, and it would be sort of off point
Yeah, yeah,
in a magazine article. So I like the freedom of a book, but it's a lot of work. It took me 5 years to research and write Ravenous. So it might be a while before I do something like that again, if I
yeah.
ever do.
It's definitely a time commitment. So I also think it's nice to think about um, this world of getting the message out about metabolic health and the dietary patterns that support that. And I do want to do a shout out to Gary Taubes again, uh, and to Nina Teicholz, who was involved with the Metabolic Revolution as well. She was like the MC when we had the rally.
Yeah, yeah, I was there.
That's right. So she's amazing. And so this is the thing. Um, two journalists um, will have some of the biggest impact on us removing our fear of saturated fat and just understanding the dietary guidelines are not very useful to journalists. And for you being a storyteller, in your mind, how do you see your storytelling beyond what you've already done, advancing awareness about metabolic health?
Um, yeah, well, I think that every time you can share information in the form of a story, it is easier for people to absorb it and make sense of. That's why when I wanted to write Ravenous, I didn't decide to write it until I had the character of Otto Warburg, because then I had a way to tell a story. And the book really traces the story of his life, and I wove in the science along the way. So I think you have to be able, there's no point in having information and sharing information if people don't absorb it. That's why I kind of hate textbooks in a way. Kind of like the whole point is, to not just give information that nobody wants to read, but to give it in a way that people will take it into their own minds. Um, and I do think that journalists, I think it's not a coincidence that Gary and Nina have been able to popularize these ideas, not just because they're good storytellers, but also because they were outsiders. If you go through the system and you're educated in a certain way, it's much harder to challenge or to look at things from the outside. So I think, Gary and Nina, they had no incentive to support low carb or low fat or anything. They were just interested in the science, and it's a much it's a much better way to approach a problem when you don't have a pre-existing bias. Of course, once you develop ideas, then of course biases arise, and that's inevitable to some extent. But I really like that the journalists have led the way as outsiders who were just looking for answers and had nothing, sort of no skin in the game.
Yeah, I work for Advocate Healthcare, and we're in 6 states. I'm in Illinois and Chicago, and before we merged with Aurora Health in Wisconsin and Atrium in North South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, we had the Advocate operating system, and with the Advocate operating system, we had this great leader, Alex Andrade, who um, was an outsider. He actually worked for literally like Nike or something before he came to this health system. And it was really about process improvement. And I've learned that you can be a manager of anything and still manage anything. And he brought this process improvement to healthcare. And and because he was an outsider, he taught us how to uh, see the world through a different lens. It's almost like if you were to sell your house, and I'm sitting in my basement where I record my podcast, what how could you see your house as a person who wants to buy it, right? If you walk, because we just kind of walk in and we just are used to what we're used to, and that's what he allowed us to do. And I remember him doing that with many aspects of our clinic. And then the one that always shares the one about the hand sanitizer and how it used to be around by the sink. And he said, does it make sense to have the hand sanitizer by the sink? And the answer was, well, if I got to go and shake the patient's hand, if I got to, certain things that would be nice to have it by the door. So it
Yeah.
was just little simple things like that that I think having outsiders with like a little bit of a clean slate as opposed to, well, this is the way we've always done it,
Yeah.
that's kind of what your insights remind me of.
Yeah, and maybe just to pull it all together, I'd say that I think it's a very important skill for a writer and creative writer to be able to get into that mindset. When I teach creative writing and even fiction writing to my students, I have them sometimes do an exercise where they imagine an alien coming to Earth and describing like what the alien makes of all this. Just sort of forces
Right.
you into that way of thinking. But the creative writing I love is often involves sort of looking at common mundane things and describing it in fresh ways or making me think about it in new ways. So it really all comes together, I think, in that
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
It's hard to look at things with fresh eyes. That's I think the best part of travel too is just it forces you
Yeah.
to sort of open your eyes in a different
It
way.
does. In fact, I saw some of those innovations, and and I think I was in France, and I would go into the bathrooms at the airport, and they just had like innovations. Before we had the water just automatically pouring or drying your hand or whatever. Even before the pandemic, they were doing stuff like that. Their bathroom experience was different because they kind of thought outside the box and how can I minimize germ spreading in a bathroom so that how you have to take in America we have to take the paper that we dry our hands with, and then we had to grab the knob with it and all of this other stuff. Well, they found ways where you didn't have to worry about the door, and you had ways to be safe. So it's really nice to see that different lens.
Yeah.
But I want to say this: I'm very excited that you are a storyteller because I do agree that you can remember things easier. It's more emotional, and if I knew the story of Warburg, I think that's a great way to then share beyond, his story, the part that deals with, the metabolic parts. And I do want to encourage those who didn't check out Jessica Apple's interview uh, because during that interview she mentioned, uh, you know, juice and smoothies, and that our babies shouldn't really be consuming those things. I remember my kids were little, juice was like water. I think they drank more juice than water. Uh, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's like who knew, right? I didn't know it was 7 teaspoons of sugar. I thought it was, and then we had enough gall to get like those green machine so-called smoothie drinks that you buy in the store. And when you look at the label, they could be anywhere from 50 to 65 carbs per serving. So it's really, and when you do the math and divide it by four, you just have, 12 to 17 teaspoons of sugar per serving. And who would feed their babies that? So I think we need to do a better job. And I'm happy that she was kind of dramatically stating, making a case. Reality is, there are some people plant based thriving with a plant based diet. Uh, who are eating a whole foods plant based diet. So that's not my preference, but we don't want to get so much into a bubble that we're thinking if I eat an apple today, something bad's going to happen. It's like we don't want to get crazy. So I agree with you 100%. Um, as you, this will be my last question for you, which I ask all guests. uh, we want to protect our nest, right? And I'm not just talking about the bank account. We want to protect ourselves, our partners, our babies, and mom, dad, and whoever else is around. So, rather it's nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep, how you think, recovering from trauma, and our rope climbs us up to the tree, and that deals with relationships, making sure we avoid things that can harm us, like harmful organisms or pollutants. And of course, our E is for making sure our life experiences serve us and we protect our emotions. And for those who enjoyed this episode, I definitely recommend diving into Sam's books. He has a lot of different books. We only talked about two today. So, again, I'll have links to Ravenous and Baby Dunks a lot in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share, and you're checking it out on YouTube, subscribe to that channel. If it's on the podcast app, subscribe to the episodes on the podcast app so we can have more conversations that will empower us to achieve metabolic health. I hope everybody have a good rest of their day, and just thank you for taking time to be with us. And until we do it again, guys, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest. All right, guys, that'll be the last question I'll be asking Sam. Um, when I checked out the video recording, there was part of the interview that was cut off at the very end. So I do want to take this moment to thank Sam for coming to this conversation. I think his conversation provided some inspiration and insights that were very helpful. I really loved his book, Baby Dunks, a lot. Groundbreaking book, Revelations. I think his work really embodies the power of storytelling to educate, entertain, and inspire. So I really appreciate him sharing his aspects. And for those who checked us out, make sure to check out the links in the video where we're going to share the link to Ravenous and, of course, Baby Dunks a lot in some of his other books. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it, like, subscribe. If you're on YouTube or in a podcast app, so we can continue to have conversations that empower us to take charge of our metabolic health. And until we have another episode of the Protecting Your Nest podcast, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest.